Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Chris Kennedy. I'm the programmer for the year-round version of Wavelengths here at TIFF Bell Lightbox. Couple exciting things we're doing this fall. October 29th, we start a very personal story, the video art of Lisa Steele. It's a 3-program retrospective of the work of local video artist, video art pioneer, Lisa Steele. Really amazing work, and I hope you can join us for that. And also on December 5th, closing out the series this year, is Ivan Ladislav Galeta and Art. It's a program of the films and a video by Ivan Galeta, who is a Croatian filmmaker who's actually fairly underknown in North America. His films have toured a little bit, but this is a chance to see a full program of his really stunning work. So those are the things to look forward to. You can find out more information about those screenings online at tiff.net/wavelengths, or you could pick up the 180 catalog down in the bookstore. And also in the bookstore, while you're down there, you can pick up Zoological Surrealisms, the non-human cinema of Jean Painlevé, which is the book that we're celebrating tonight. The book is written by James Cahill, who is joining us tonight to present a short introduction to these films, and then we'll watch the films that he selected for this evening. James is the director of the Cinema Studies Institute at the University of Toronto and associate professor of both cinema studies and film at U of T. And he joins us to talk about it, a little bit about Painlevé and the book that he was inspired by.
Well, thank you so much. And really thanks to Chris Kennedy for making this dream come true, not only in showing these films, some of these restorations I have not myself yet seen, so I'm thrilled to see in a big screen, but also for collecting a room full of some of the people I most adore in this town. And I see many of you out there, many colleagues, many friends, many collaborators, many former students who are now kind of leading and running the cinema culture in Toronto. So I just thank you for coming out. I should also thank Brigitte Berg and Les Documents Cinématographiques in Paris for making these films available to us. And thank you all for coming, on a Tuesday night to snack quietly while taking in a true feast for the eyes. And one of the things that Jean Painlevé kind of politically incorrectly liked to joke about was the best part of being an animal filmmaker was after you wrapped, you could eat all of your stars. So the title of this screening, comes from the title of my new book, Zoological Surrealism, the non-human cinema of Jean Painlevé, which, as Chris said, you can find very, close by. Now, the book is a study, an archive-based study of the first 25 years of the work by this surreal wildlife and scientific filmmaker. And through the bias of Jean Painlevé and his work, I rethink the entangled histories of cinema, surrealism, and contemporaneous scientific research. Now, I know you've come to see movies, not listen to some square prattle on, so I'm going to try to be very restrained in my talk, but I'll say a few things about Jean Painlevé and his key collaborators, their work's particular contribution to surrealism, and then a few details about the films we'll encounter this evening. So Jean Painlevé was born in Paris on 20 November 1902 to Julie Marie Marguerite Petit de Villeneuve, whose name and the length of whose name should connote something of her family's bourgeois standing, and Paul Painlevé, who was an illustrious mathematician and politician. He was a member of the Radical Party, who over the kind of span of Jean's childhood would rise to hold the highest offices in France. Now, Jean's mother died shortly after his birth from puerperal fever, and he was raised by his father as well as his father's sister. Now, like any self-respecting child of an academic, Jean was an exceedingly poor student. He enjoyed playing hooky at the menagerie of the Jardin des Plantes, where zookeepers let him help out feeding animals and fostering his fascination for strange creatures. Now, like any self-respecting child of a politician, Jean was also a self-proclaimed anarchist who delighted in getting arrested for protesting his father's policies. Now, as a young man, he became interested in automobile racing, piloting, jazz music and culture, and was a pioneer scuba diver, and participated in many of the aesthetic and political avant-gardes of his moment. There we have a picture of him hanging out with his pal Sergei Eisenstein. And among his other if you judge someone by the company they keep, among his friends and collaborators were Sergei Eisenstein, Luis Buñuel, the Prévert brothers, Pierre and Jacques, Jean Vigo, the artist Antonin Artaud, Fernand Léger, Pablo Picasso, Alexander Calder, the photographer Jacques-André Boiffard, Philippe Haussmann, and Hille. Now, poor academic transcripts and arrest records aside didn't really prevent him from being admitted to the Sorbonne, and as we know, having famous parents can help with those things, where he eventually studied comparative anatomy, the field dedicated to the study of organic function and form across the animal kingdom. And he worked in the laboratory of Paul Ventrobert. Ventrobert was a pioneering figure in the field, and one of the things that made him unique was that he really encouraged his students to take advantage of the newest techniques in microscopy, photography, and cinematography in their research, and to also engage in field work rather than staying in the laboratory, so as to better understand the milieu and life ways of the organisms they researched. And I think another unique thing about Ventrobert, who is the mustachioed gentleman looking like Poirot in the front there, is that his laboratory had an inordinate amount of women, in the 20s. And there we have Jean Painlevé in the back. Now, the decision to study comparative anatomy would prove to be decisive. Not only did Jean find a field that suited his interests and talents, and in 1924 he presented 3 research papers before the French Academy of Sciences on the processes of vital staining of protoplasm, which made him at the time the second youngest researcher to ever present before this august body, his father being the first. But he was also initiated into a very particular practice of seeing that played an important, if underappreciated, role in the history of French Surrealism. Now, all students in the Sorbonne's Physique, Chimique, et Sciences Naturelles, or the physics, chemistry, and natural sciences sequence at the university were required to study comparative anatomy. And among the students who followed the same sequence of courses, and in fact had the same teachers just a few years apart, were André Breton, Louis Aragon, Jacques-André Boiffard, a classmate and close friend of Painlevé's, as well as Painlevé. Now, if these names ring some bells, it's because they are the founders of Parisian Surrealism. And one of the key arguments of my book, plug again, is that the French iteration of Surrealism owes important debts to the practices of seeing, dissecting, comparative thinking, and imaginative reassembly first rehearsed in the comparative anatomy laboratories of the Sorbonne. It is at the dissection table that the original exquisite corpses of Surrealism were born. Now, the Surrealism of Breton, Aragon, and Boiffard primarily focused on developing techniques for unleashing the energies of dreams and the unconscious, for a revolutionary rethinking of everyday life and of the world. Now, Painlevé participated at the margins of these activities. He contributed a prose poem, Neo-Zoological Surrealism, which is effectively a cut-up of his laboratory notes, to Yvan Gold's journal Surrealism, published in 10 October 1924. He was the unnamed surrealist photographer who provided the doodles of various cabinet members pilfered from his father's office to the journal La Révolution Surrealiste, and he collaborated on a multimedia theater production with Antonin Artaud, which, and I know Chelsea's in the audience, but Chelsea Phillips Carr has written beautifully on. Now, furthermore, his photographs and film stills appeared in Georges Bataille's important counter-surrealist journal Document. And so just to give you a kind of a little example of the way that Surrealism found its origins in comparative anatomy. We have a photograph from Jacques-André Boiffat and then a photograph from Jean Painlevé, which used the same exact set of aesthetics and kind of skills of dissection and close-up that were trained in the laboratories. Now, but rather than being a card-carrying member of any of the various surrealist camps battling it out in Paris, Painlevé and his collaborators developed their own form of surrealism, a zoological surrealism, based not in dreams and the unconscious, but in the strangeness of nature and animal life, particularly as encountered through media technologies. Now, perhaps the quickest way to summarize my kind of main understanding of Painlevé's work and its contributions to cinema history and theory is through a juxtaposition of two frames from his 1928 documentary, Les Oursins, or The Sea Urchins. Now, the footage depicts Painlevé doing the tides, or searching the seashore and tidal pools for specimens, while also observing the inhabitants of the ecosystem in situ. Now, Painlevé briefly assumes the pose of Narcissus, appearing as if transfixed by his own reflection and reaching out to caress the beautiful visage in front of him. Breaking the water's surface, he reaches beyond his reflected face, now gently palpitating and deformed by ripples of water, and retrieves a sea urchin, which he inspects with some fascination. And spectators of the film will know that this is a rock urchin, because there's title cards that tell us as much. Now, the shift in attention from self-regard to non-human other, and the ripples or impact that such a perceptual pivot may have on one's self-image, presents in condensed form the main argument of my book, that the films of Jean Painlevé developed a mode of looking and a surreal practice of cinematic encounter that, in turning its attention to animal life and non-human worlds, also critically altered conceptions of human ones. He developed a practice of anthropomorphism without anthropocentrism, such that it asks viewers to consider what animals might teach us about being human differently, rather than simply how they might reflect our all too human values and foibles. Now, no discussion of Painlevé's work is complete without attention to his key collaborator, Geneviève Hamon, or Ginette, as she was affectionately called. Now, Ginette was the daughter of Auguste and Henriette Hamon, who were the anarchist French translators of Georges Bernard Shaw, and she met Painlevé through her eldest sister, Marie-Yvonne Hamon, a marine biologist and classmate of Painlevé's at the Sorbonne. From 1927 onwards, Ginette worked with Painlevé on nearly all of his films, first as an assistant, helping with the gathering and cure of specimens, as well as setting up the decor of aquariums, and eventually, starting in 1960, as the co-director of many of his films. And there she is gathering specimens with a gitan sticking out of her mouth. She, all the same, though, remains a somewhat enigmatic figure, for whom there are few archival traces, and believe me, I looked, and this may perhaps be due to negligence, often afforded to women filmmakers of this time, but it could also perhaps be due to her own furtive desires. When photographed, she would often hold animals up in front of her face, and this is one of several samples I found in the archives in her own kind of personal photographs. And this shows a canny ability for creating in-frame surreal chimeras, but also giving us a lesson with how to think about her contributions to the film signed Painlevé or Painlevé and Hamon, which is to look to the animals, for it is in their appearance that some of her presence persists. Now, through the writing of my book, I came to think of Painlevé's work less as films than as surrealist monads. Now, a monad is a fancy word, and I'm borrowing it from the German philosopher and fellow traveler of the Surrealists, Walter Benjamin, who conceptualized the monad as an image of the world contained within an idea or an object. Now, tonight's movies all contain surreal images of the worlds in which they were produced and the worlds they sought to present, which intercalate rigorous documentation, audacious fantasy, provocation, and critical interpretation. if the archives sent us the correct films, and I've now learned that they have, we're going to have the treat of seeing 4 recent restorations, as well as a 35mm print of Painlevé's masterpiece, Le Vampire. So let me just say a few things about each of the films we're going to watch in the order we'll watch them. We're going to begin with La Pieuvre, or The Octopus, from 1928. Now, this was Painlevé's first theatrical film, as opposed to films that were made in a laboratory research context. And it was a favorite film of Pablo Picasso's. It draws out the uncanny dimensions of the natural historian's gaze through an intimate portrait of the anatomy, habits, and struggles of the common octopus. The film's opening sequence of an octopus crawling from a laboratory table through a creative geography of unusual spaces that will end in the tidal pools of Brittany allegorizes the process by which Painlevé took his training in comparative anatomy out of the laboratory and into the wild to develop it into a cinematic surrealism. The film is also a wonderful experiment in a surrealism of scales through its ingenious use of microcinematography and close-ups. And for reference, keep in mind that the film's daring editing predated that of Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali's Un chien andalou by about 4 months. So something that will look very familiar from surrealist cinema is kind of rehearsed here a little bit earlier. We're then going to watch L'Hippocampe, or The Seahorse. And we're going to watch the silent version that is dated around 1931. This was just restored. I'm pretty sure it's never been shown in North America. The film that he would remake in a sound version became Painlevé's only commercial success and became something of a mini phenomena when it played in popular cinemas throughout 1935. It was one of the first films that attempted to make use of filming with scuba equipment, though marketing pitches aside, none of that footage ended up in the final film. And I'm unsure, because I haven't seen the full thing, whether any of that footage is in the silent version we're going to watch tonight. If it is, we'll be able to know, because it'll be really muddy because of all the sediment that was kind of kicked up trying to film underwater. Now, the film focuses on the surprising mating habits and reproduction habits of seahorses. And Painlevé's film suggests that surrealism is, to quote Apollinaire, born of a transformation of sex. The film delighted radical feminists who saw in it a critical revision of gender and sex roles, and it also delighted traditional conservatives who viewed it as an ode to the virtues of large families at a moment when the nation feared declining population. It's also a fantasy of prodigious male birth. Now, following the surprise success of the film, Painlevé and Hamon launched a jewelry line inspired by it, which they marketed as a kind of talisman of contradictory forces and a fetish to bring one luck and reconciliation in love, whatever form it took. Now, in the archives, I also found a letter from a Paris-based psychoanalyst named Edouard Monat-Herzon, who admitted to Painlevé that he was prescribing the film to all of his patients. Okay, and we will then watch a 35mm print of Le Vampire, or The Vampire, from 1945. Now, the film was actually begun as a commission by the Pasteur Institute for studying vectors, which are animals that transmit disease, mostly through bloodborne manners. The film, of course, was not completed in 1939 because shortly after he started to shoot it, World War II broke out. In the years of the war, Painlevé fought fascism as a member of the resistance. His codename was The Man in Brown. And I think the film is a perfect horror film. It mixes documentary and found footage of hematophagic creatures, or bloodsuckers, with a hot jazz soundtrack by Duke Ellington to produce a nature documentary that is also a timely anti-fascist allegory. We'll conclude We'll conclude our program with two films made later than my book, but I think are just wonderful documents. The first is Asera, ou le bal des sorcières, or Asira, or the Witches' Dance. This is co-directed by Geneviève Hamon, and it's a film that's a kind of dazzling ode to Loie Fuller and the kind of Loie Fuller-esque courting dances of this gastropod, the Acera, and it's set to a score by the composer Pierre Janssen. Look out for flashes of a cameo by the modernist dancer and choreographer Michel Nadal. And watching this, if you're anything like me, you may reconsider the appeal of being a sea slug. And we'll end the program with Painlevé's Cristaux Liquide, or Liquid Crystals, from 1978. If Painlevé's career started at the intersections of science and surrealism, it came to a close with the convergence of science and psychedelia. As the archivist Marie Jaeger has noted, the film documents the production of liquid crystals, which are now the basis of our LCD television monitors. So might we see in this an anticipation of the passage from cinema to the multi-screen worlds we now inhabit? In 1955, the critic André Bazin wrote, "Animal films reveal the cinema to us." Nature films don't just teach us about animals, they teach us about the medium, as well as the people behind the camera and the culture they belong to and wish to produce. The surreal animal films of Jean Painlevé and Geneviève Hamon have much to teach us about animals, humans, love, sex, eating, the cinema, and increasingly the surreal transformations of our own world. They also teach us a way of looking at the world with curiosity, rigor, and an eye hospitable to the strange and the unexpected. So enjoy the films.